Hi, I'm Professor Green, and today we're going to be talking about Chapter 1 from our textbook, Globalization. I'm going to go ahead and start the slideshow. This is a really great textbook, or a great course, I think. And Chapter 1 here introduces us to the idea of globalization, what it is, and what are the key components. So the key learning objectives from this chapter include understanding what is meant by the term globalization, which I think is more important today than it ever was, because we keep talking about now that the Ukraine crisis is happening and things, is it the end of globalization, right? We'll learn in this chapter, it definitely is not, but that there is a change. There's definitely a hurdle that we're going to overcome in the next couple of years when it comes to globalization. Second one, recognize the main drivers of globalization. So how does globalization come about? Describe the changing nature of the global economy. And this really comes in to play every day these days because of the Ukraine crisis. The next thing is explaining the main arguments in the debate over the impact of globalization, right? Not everybody is pro-globalization like myself and other people who are into international business. Some people really think that it's not a good thing and that we shouldn't really be focusing more on our own country. And the last one is understanding how the process of globalization is creating opportunities and challenges for management practice. So let's hop into the next slide. The opening case is a simple one, but a good one, right? Detroit Bikes, they decided to sell bikes out of Detroit, right? Here it says by 2018, about 95% of bikes sold in the US were assembled in China. About 65% of the components were also produced in China. So that was a good thing, right? I think, because American consumers benefited from those lower prices. But Detroit Bikes decided to be an exception. They tried to to outsource, exception to outsourcing trends. So they wanted to put them together in Detroit, but they wanted to get the parts from China. Unfortunately for them, or fortunately, as we see in the case, 2018 created some tariffs and a trade war because Trump said we needed to really focus more on the United States, and he was really afraid of China really taking over the world because they got so efficient in production. And so now that more bikes had to be assembled in the United States because we weren't allowed to, or it was becoming more expensive to import full bikes, which is great. So they were becoming, Detroit bikes had more of an opportunity. But they also had a challenge because they got their parts from China. And okay, now they can't get their parts as easily from China. And so what does that mean? They could go to Cambodia or they could go to Thailand, but it's not as simple to just quickly change suppliers. So that's a really good example of what globalization is. And we'll go into detail here in the next couple of slides as to how this all comes together. So the introduction to this course, to this chapter, fewer self-contained national economies, right? As you can imagine, right? If you've ever traveled to another country, you see bits and pieces of America and Europe within that country. We export, we import, right? The clothing that I'm wearing, is made in China. The hair products that I use are made in Germany, et cetera. The car that I drive, right, is maybe made in Korea, et cetera. More integrated global economic system with low barriers to trade and investment. And we'll talk more about that in this course, in this chapter, about how it's really cheap compared to decades ago to get things across borders. Transformation is called globalization. So I guess in the big picture, right, things that are changing, we can categorize as globalization. And then today, the benefits of globalization are more in dispute than at any other time in the last half century. So the last like 50, 70 years. Right. And so since the 1950s, everyone's been gung-ho about globalization and seeing that it's creating more efficiencies, more opportunities for markets, et cetera, et cetera. But in like 2018 or so, as I said, when our textbook was published, that Trump was coming forward and saying, actually, we need to create America first. And he was trying to really push back on all the imports that we have coming in from Asia. So this shift has created many challenges and some opportunities too, as we saw in the Detroit bike situation. But nonetheless, as our author says of this textbook, globalization continues to impact almost everything that we do. So what is globalization? It's broken down in two pieces. Well, first, it's a shift towards a more integrated and independent world economy, as you've already probably heard me talk about. But there are two facets. It's globalization of markets and a globalization of production. Let's talk about those. Globalization of markets. This is where certain products, certain companies are across borders. Coca-Cola, McDonald's, you see in every single country. IKEA is not really just Swedish or Northern European anymore. It's everywhere. Starbucks in every country. Everybody in any country can pretty much get an Apple phone. So this is the merging of historically distinct and separate national markets into one huge global marketplace. The tastes and preferences of consumers are sometimes converging onto a global norm. So yes, we have different varieties of Coca-Cola across borders, but at the end of the day, they're still all drinking Coca-Cola, which is, very similar to the original recipe. And most global markets are for the industry. The most of global markets are actually for industrial goods and services, goods and materials. So yes, we have the consumer products like Coca-Cola, McDonald's, Apple, etc. But most of the markets are actually for these things like aluminum, oil, wheat, microprocessors. So things that we don't necessarily see as a consumer. So just to know, I think that this slide tells us that there's much more globalization out there probably than we even realize. What is globalization of production? This is where we source goods and services from locations around the world, right, to take advantage of differences in cost and quality, labor, energy, land, capital, right? This is all about getting people in India to answer the cell phone, to answer the call center calls. This is about getting a lower overall cost structure and improvement of the quality or functionality of a product to compete more effectively. And we'll talk a lot about why India has been called upon to be our center for engineering and call centers, etc. So one last slide here on globalization, or on globalization of production, I should say. Early outsourcing was primarily for manufacturing. So, right, initially we were just getting, these products that we need to make other products initially abroad. But today, actually, modern communications technology allows companies to outsource services as well. So telecom, and consulting services, etc. All those can be done abroad as well because of the internet. There are some impediments to globalization, right? And so globalization sounds great, so easy, so simple, right? But not necessarily always the case. There are some, 5 or so major things that could happen to kind of pause or halt or slow down globalization. The first one being formal and informal trade barriers. Just as I was saying, Trump was putting up some trade barriers with China, putting tariffs on imports that are coming in from China, barriers to foreign direct investment. So this is all about, saying, okay, we want to invest in India for our call center, but there's some barriers, right? Is India stable enough? Are the workers going to be able to show up for work on a regular basis? Is the political situation stable? Is the economy stable, etc.? So it's not always so simple to invest overseas. Transportation costs, right? Of course, it's more expensive to get things shipped in from China as it is compared to getting it shipped in from Pennsylvania. Economic and political risk. This is kind of similar to direct investment related. We'll talk a lot about that in chapter 2, that there is some economic and political risk in certain countries. And the last one is managerial challenge for coordinating globally dispersed supply chain, right? So at the end of the day, right, not simple if if you're going to be importing from many different countries as opposed to just one particular country. The languages are different, the travel times are longer. You need somebody who can, oversee all these different cultures, etc. So globalization is a cool idea, but not necessarily always the simplest. So there's some global institutions that help to manage, regulate, and police the global marketplace. And yeah, I get really excited about these global institutions because they're kind of like the bricks and the mortar, right, behind international business. And there are these organizations that started a few decades ago for the most part, and they've really set up the infrastructure and the framework as to how we can work across borders. So they promote the establishment of multinational treaties to govern the global business system, and they're created by voluntary agreements. So countries have to voluntarily join these organizations. The first one is the WTO. This polices the world trading system and ensures nation states adhere to rules established by the WTO treaties. So even if there are cultural differences or differences in how you administer contracts, etc., the WTO is a neutral place where we come to agreement on how things should happen in business. This was initially known as the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which now is known as the WTO. There are 164 member nations for 98% of world trade as of 2020. So that's great. So most countries are part of the WTO, which allows us to come to common ground on how we do business, and also for WTO to police those transactions. The next ones are the IMF and the World Bank. The IMF is the International Monetary Fund. This maintains order in the international monetary system. So, right, we're talking cross currencies. But the IMF gets in with foreign exchange and making sure that things are working properly. They are the lender of last resort. So if a country does not have enough currency, doesn't have enough cash, doesn't have enough money to support a business or to support a transaction, then they will come in and help. This requires nation states to adopt specific economic policy in return for loans. And so they are often criticized because although they will help a country coming in with funds for loans, they will also say that that country then has to abide by certain regulations, and that there's some criticism that those regulations are sometimes too strict and they are in the interest of the IMF. And we could spend, a whole semester talking about just the IMF, but really interesting to know that they exist and that they are available for countries at certain times when they need them. The next one is the World Bank. This is promoting development of using low interest loans. So this is a place where countries don't come in as like the last resort, but they come in and they say, okay, we could use some loans to help fuel some cross-border business. But again, kind of like the IMF, the World Bank is controversial, but less controversial. They don't have like as many stipulations. They seem to be more neutral. They both are headquartered in Washington, D.C. And if you ever have the experience to internship there, I highly recommend it because it just have a world of its own. I've had quite a few friends that have worked at both the IMF and the World Bank and have had amazing careers because there's just amazing exposure to so many different ideas and businesses and countries who are really, we're talking like developing countries for the most part here, who are really in need. We don't see this as much in the United States, right? Because we're more developed and we can go to a bank for most of our transactions, or the organizations can go to a bank. But in developing countries where there's a lot of risk, the IMF and World Bank play a huge part, and they just do, despite their criticism, they do a lot for moving businesses and countries forward on the global marketplace. Another organization is called the United Nations. This one is a little bit near and dear to my heart because my parents met related to the United Nations. My mother was working there at the time in the gift shop and was dating someone who worked there. And then my dad met her through him at a skiing event. And so, and my grandmother was often at the UN, et cetera, for different types of things. My parents are both from abroad, as you know. And so the UN is a really interesting place because it includes so many member states. Almost every nation in the world is a member, 193 member countries. It's committed to maintaining international peace. That's the key word when we think about the UN, peace and security. It develops friendly relations among nations. It promotes cooperation, promotes respect for human rights. If you've been watching the Iran debacle, for lack of a better term, right? Not to put it, that's too light of a word, but the Iran issue right now where women are being pushed down and being forced to wear the headwear. And people are standing up and saying the United Nations needs to step in and promote peace. And they need to make sure that there is peace happening in this country because so many women are getting arrested and killed and people protesting, etc. And so the UN, it would be the organization that would stand up and say, we are here to respect the human rights. And lastly, the Center for Harmonizing the Actions of Nations. So again, also related to the Iran current crisis. And then the last organization is the group of 20, the G20, comprised of finance ministers and central bank governors of the 19 largest world economies, plus the EU and European Central Bank. That represents 90% of the global GDP, right? So just 19 world economies represent 90% of the global GDP. Super interesting. We'll talk more about that in this chapter, about how the United States and China, right, have such a large percentage of the global GDP and how that's changing. And the G20 also became a forum for a coordinated policy response to the financial crisis of 2018 and 2019, right? So they do have a lot of power, a lot of influence, and it's good that this organization exists so these finance ministers can get together to discuss major issues, global issues. Great, so that ends our part 1 of 3. I will go ahead and stop the presentation here, and I look forward to seeing you in part 2 of chapter 1.